Hello, today we're going to be doing The Little Stranger, which is on paper 2 of the A-level English Edexcel course. And this is just going to be going over context, quite in depth, and then there'll be some quotes at the end that we can talk about with some themes. So, for the syllabus that my school does, we focus on the Gothic. And Gothic texts are the realm where the ordinary is displaced by the extraordinary, the normal becomes the paranormal, and the unconscious is as vivid, vital, and vivid as the conscious. That would be a really good sentence to just put in an essay. Maybe in the introduction if you're doing an essay about the Gothic. In this environment, it becomes difficult to orientate oneself. It's often a dark world where winding passages lead deeper and deeper into an uncanny and uncertain world. Often the protagonist is presented with a baffling series of choices, with no clear sense of what the right one might be. So that's quite clear in the picture of Dorian Gray, where, his moral choices are kind of unfolded, which is what we'll be comparing The Little Stranger to. The certainty of the normal world is rendered void once the borders of the Gothic have been breached, and a further frisson is provided by the fact that this voyage into the Gothic has been taken voluntarily and perhaps against one's better judgment. The Gothic has somehow seduced the reader so that he or she is complicit in engaging with whatever he or she might encounter. There's a lot of imagery in the Gothic, and we really feel like we're experiencing everything as if we were a character in the novel ourselves. The narrative of the text often involves journeys into the unknown, and for this novel, this is Hundred's Hall. Novels that were concerned with outsiders and whose protagonists flouted the natural order became the obvious vehicle for attacking the safe central values of a society that smugly turned its back on those who weren't born into the comfort of money, education, and power. And this is seen where Faraday is in the slowly evolving middle class. Okay, he isn't in the working class like his parents, but he doesn't quite reach the upper class and ruling class standards. He lays quite in the middle. So he's rejected by both classes and he is an outsider. The power and passion of Gothic literature seemed eminently suited to the iconoclasts who wished to challenge the status quo. Authors wished to warn society against the effect of breaking with the natural order. The protagonists who strayed off the path of reason, order, or decorum often came face to face with the consequences of their actions, rendered more terrible in the lurid world of the Gothic text. So, as Faraday more and more tries to slip into the ruling class ideology and way of life, he, punishes others who reject him and almost punishes himself um, with the killings of the heiress family. There's a clearly defined threshold over which the protagonist and the reader must step. It may be represented as a physical boundary, the dividing line between the civilized and the natural world. It might be a moral line where the protagonists break a moral law. Faraday, overcomes this threshold of, the gates of Hundred's Hall. He infiltrates the hall and the family, and he definitely breaks a lot of moral laws there with his pent up anger and frustration at his lower class. At the heart of Gothic text is the tension provided between the possible violation of innocence, the concept of virtue in distress. Her chastity was the object of the villain's desire, and the novel's landscapes and imagery often provided an obvious objective correlative for this sexual threat. So in the story, we see how Faraday, maybe like halfway through the book, starts lusting after Caroline. And the real reason for this is he is only attracted to her because he sees her as the way to have ownership of Hundred's Hall. So he becomes a sexual threat as he, makes a awkward pass at her later in the novel. But this is really him trying to own Hundred's Hall. It's not really about Caroline. And we see that in her ultimate demise when she dies. In 1066, nobles funded large estates and castles or large manor houses with pleasure parks for hunting. In the 14th century, titles were bestowed based on the amount of persons' land holdings. So this caused the nobles to acquire large tracts of land to add to their existing estates. So obviously, Hundred's Hall is an example of before the war of what these large manor houses would look like. We're shown the grandeur, and the genteel qualities that the aristocrats living there would have. In many areas, country houses were the main source of employment. The relationship between the estates and its surrounding community has always been of an economic and cultural nature, and this is seen straight away in the novel, because Faraday's parents worked on Hunger's Hall. They were, maids, they almost servants. They were just working in the manor house, and it was very important for economic development in this time. After the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the working and middle class, English country houses and their landowners entered a period that shook the social and financial foundations the estate were built upon. And this is mainly because people were drifting away from working in these big manor houses. They were going into more factory work and, physical manual labour. Economic, fiscal, and social pressures, accelerated by two world wars and the depressions of the 1890s and 1930s, have caused the outright breakup of many estates and the size and sale reduction of most others. So, after these, economic crises, there was no one to maintain the land. They couldn't afford to pay workers, but the workers weren't working there anyway. They were already going off into their, urbanized and industrial jobs. So there was no one to work, and there was, people just didn't have the money to pay them anymore. Without the workers, people were no longer able to maintain their homes, and so abandoned or destroyed them. And to save their estates, many owners began to sell tracts of land. The National Trust emerged, allowing homeowners to pass their houses and collections to the trust. In return for opening the houses to the public for a set period each year, the homeowner was allowed to remain in the house and avoid tax and death duties. And I haven't mentioned it here, but during the war, some of these houses were used for soldiers as like a base. So they were also destroyed in that way. They had a lot of damage done to the houses. The idea of classic realism. So, in the 1700s to the 1800s, most teenage and children's books followed this model. These are novels which aren't what we traditionally think novels do. They tell a story about real people and real events and bring this to a resolution. Descriptions of the external world, the thoughts and feelings of characters, dialogue, and action are all well balanced. The overall impression is of like liveness. Often the narrator is either omniscient or first person. And, we can see this because Faraday is telling a first-hand account of everything that happened 3 years prior that is a little stranger. He's the unreliable narrator. Modernist novels in 1914 reflect the breaking up of society and ideas precipitated by the cataclysm of World War One. It was more experimental than its predecessors. They react to the ideas of Sigmund Freud and were less interested in describing external reality, which is what the characters look like. It focused a lot more on the setting than in conveying the inner life of subjective experience, the fluidity and uncertainty of identity. Hence, modernist novels are characterized particularly using a stream of consciousness, and this is obviously seen in Faraday as well, because we're focusing on his mental processes and how his thoughts create all of these actions, this decline in morality and destruction. In modernist novels in the 1930s to the 1940s, at first a contrast and reaction to modernism, before developing into a myriad of different ways. It embraced the freedom of the post-World War One. They returned to some of the conventions of the classic realism, such as an interest in external reality, but put a new spin on things. They're particularly characterized using metafiction, intermixing genes, reflecting the relativism and interconnectivity of the modern world. And that could be due to globalization. Traditional boundaries between high and low art, between one genre and another, between author and character are frequently crossed and recrossed in postmodernist novels. How Faraday's thoughts are conveyed to us is very important in showing that it gives a postmodernist novel feel. It is based in the 1940s, and we see his thoughts and we know that he ultimately is the little stranger. Um, and we have that relationship with Faraday, but not a positive one. The gender history of 19th century Britain can be read in two ways: as an overarching patriarchal model which reserved power and privilege for men, or as a process of determined but gradual female challenge to their exclusion. So, for example, we've got the character of Caroline, who really challenges the gender stereotypes of women during this time, and especially the aristocratic women. Um, we are described by Faraday that she's got a very masculine appearance and she doesn't try to be overtly feminine. However, this could just be due to, her lack of wealth. Like for example, when they're going to the dance together, Caroline does dress up and she does try to look more feminine, but almost pathetically, um, because she's wearing an old gown and something that doesn't fit, and that just really goes to show the decline in her wealth and status. The period witnessed a distinctive shift in ideas respecting gender relations, turning away from a traditional idea of natural male supremacy towards a modern notion of gender equity. The process was vigorously contested and by no means achieved. And we can see this at the dance. Um, where Graham says during the dance, which I think is chapter 8, he says, "You've seen her on horseback, a pity she hasn't got the looks to match." Important legal, educational, professional, and personal changes took place. As women gained autonomy and opportunities, male power was significantly lowered. However, men didn't lose legal obligation to provide financially or their right to domestic services within the family. Moreover, the key symbol of democratic equality, the parliamentary franchise, was expressed repeatedly withheld from women. An example is this is probably how there's a policy that working women, um, women that have like a disability or like an injury, so they can't do housework, if they're in a marriage, they're not entitled to any benefits, and men aren't. But men are entitled to these benefits without question. But if a woman is single, then they'll only be allowed these benefits because they can't do the housework themselves. So it kind of goes to show a sort of balance, to show that the shift of the domestic duties is handed to the man. However, the fact that there isn't that in question anyway, like suggesting that men don't already do housework, kind of just goes to show that there is still a power imbalance during this time. The Victorian age saw major changes in knowledge and practice relating to public sanitation, largely in response to population growth and rapid urbanisation, with the gradual provision of piped water, sewerage, and improved housing. In medicine, microbacterial understanding led to better control of infectious diseases, avoidance of cross contamination in surgery, and prevention of specific diseases through vaccination. Traditional treatments and nursing practices evolved to improve recovery rates, but there were very few drug remedies and overall morbidity and mortality remained high. Hospital-based medicine catered largely for the poor, many of whom ended their days in the local workhouse infirmary. Middle and upper class patients were attended in their own homes, and this is obviously reminiscent of Faraday being called to the house. Well, actually, it was Seeley, but Seeley handed over that job to Faraday. Faraday would typically take on the more lower class cases, and this kind of goes to show why he was so excited to attend to the upper class house of Hundreds Hall in the first place, because it's not usually his responsibility. In mental health, patients were steadily concentrated in large, highly regulated lunatic asylums outside the urban areas. Science began to challenge religion as the dominant epistemology, but in support of similar ideas. So, science and religion are obviously both meta narratives, as the postmodernists explain, but people were increasingly taking on the ideas of science instead of religion. It really came into question during this time. So, here I've found some quotes with the book pages, specifically on the supernatural and Gothic setting and decline. And there's also a quote about the Little Stranger library, which is really important because if we're getting a Gothic question or a question on setting, we can compare that to Dorian Gray's playroom, and also we can compare it to Lord Henry's library in the picture of Dorian Gray. So, in the supernatural, the mark was small and black like a scorch mark. Rod had been watching the glass make its shuddering way towards him, sick with horror at what he kept calling the wrongness of the thing. This is obviously very gothic, it's very supernatural. Seen from hell, unimaginably hot, lit up by thousands diabolical points, thick with whirling embers and tongues of fire. The whistle was purposeful, demanding, something like the wail of a siren or the cry of a hungry baby. And in this line, we can definitely see that it foreshadows the unveil of the baby that Mrs. Ayres lost, Suki. 3 small drops of crimson seemed to spring from nowhere to the surface of the silk, and then, like ink blossoming on paper, rapidly to spread. In the belly of the house. Personifying the house really goes to show how Faraday has taken over the house as if it's a real person. Her cheek and lip had turned into dropping loads of flesh. A creature motivated by all the nasty impulses and hungers the conscious mind had hoped to keep hidden away, things like envy and malice and frustration. This is just Faraday, basically just him outlining, saying, oh, this is happening because of this, but it's actually him. A classic example of him being an unreliable narrator. Leaping yellow light and smelt smoke and realised that the house was on fire. Roderick's removal, I feel like this is a really frightening line. The alliteration really just adds to it all. His removal. Removing Roderick as the man of the house, the only man left, just allows Faraday as, the stereotypical man, protective, for him to just take over. But this is actually quite ironic because Faraday is hardly a strong figure. He's actually very weak. He hasn't been brought up with wealth, and he has a lot of insecurities about his looks, his age, and his professional ability as he fails to cater for more wealthy families. He's underpaid compared to Seeley. The house has the feel of a castle dungeon. Hundreds Hall withdrew even further from the world, the solid brown stone boundary wall, high enough to seem forbidding. Again, Faraday is infiltrating the house. He's inserting himself in the house and all of its works. He takes down these boundaries by forming relationships with the females in the home. Creeping chaos of nettle and weed, a chaos of nettle and bindweed. The house was a collapsing like a pyramid of cards, as if the house was developing scars of its own in response to its unhappiness. And I feel like this is similar to when Mrs. Ayres experiences the spirit of her child that died, where it's scratching her. I feel like that links quite well. Hundreds is lovely, but it's sort of a monster. Again, personification. Hundreds was consumed by some dark gem, some ravenous shadow, creature, some little stranger. The front door was drawn gratingly open, just allowing Faraday to I keep saying infiltrate, but I feel like that's the best word to use to describe it. I remember its lovely aging details, the worn red brick, the cockled window glass, and the weathered sandstone edgings. They made it look blurred and slightly uncertain. His intense memory of the building just goes to show his raw obsession with the building. And also how it says that it's blurred and slightly uncertain. That's quite similar to how the upper class felt after the wars. They're uncertain of their wealth, it's declining, and they're uncertain of their status as the upper class really decreased. The rise of the middle class and working classes meant that there was no place for these people to go. They didn't want to live the lower class lifestyles because of the way they were raised, yet they didn't have anything else to do. They didn't have the money to continue their lavish and luxury, things. They just didn't have the money for it. The thrill of the house itself. What horrified me were the signs of decay. Sections of the lovely weathered edging seemed to have fallen completely away, so that the house's uncertain Georgian outline was even more tentative than before. Ivy had spread, then patchily died, and hung like tangled rat's tail hair. The word hung just links to Mrs. Ayres. In her suicide. Everything in, I'd say, the opening chapter foreshadows something later. Somehow the essential loveliness of the room stood out like the handsome bones behind a ravaged face. Bones, again, is just a recurring motif of death and decay that's seen throughout all of the characters in the novel. Here are some quotes to show Faraday's anger, his involvement in the supernatural, and love. Well, lust, actually. The words tried to drive me into secret rages. What horrified me were the signs of decay. His tone was friendly enough, but had a touch of languor to it, as if he was bored by the sight of me already. This just goes to show his class frustration. Die of fright in this lovely house. You're lucky you have the chance to live here. His jealousy and his envy of the upper class. I felt a flicker of impatience with them, the faintest stirring of a dark dislike, and my pleasure in the room was slightly spoiled. Perhaps it was the peasant blood in me rising. He is just so jealous that he can't live this lifestyle. How hard his parents worked and he's worked to get out of the working class. It's just not enough for him. He wants to possess it. Mrs. Beatrice Ayres would every so often come unannounced to the maids' bedrooms and turn out their boxes, going through their possessions piece by piece. They don't like me, they never have. I'm not grand enough for the gentry, not grand enough for working people, come to that. They want to look up to their doctor, they don't want to think he's one of them. Again, this is just where he is an outsider and rejected by both classes. I've had occasional dark hours, the moments of cowardice and disappointment. I saw a curious sort of after image of my day was Hundreds Hall, and I pictured the people inside it as they must be now. Betty in her room, Mrs. Ayres and Caroline in theirs, Roderick in his. I suddenly wished the car weren't quite so small and ancient. I had to live up to the occasion. My make do and mend appearance was not very heartening. My hair had recently started to thin. I seemed bald and was bleary with lack of sleep. Graham and Anne tickled by the thought of me hobnobbing with the heiresses. Graham laughed out loud at the sight of me. They weren't the sort of people I usually mix with. This goes to show the class divide and all of the confusion after the wars, because the upper classes were forced to communicate to the middle and working classes. And this was also strange for all of the classes to be speaking to one another. The respect that was for each classes and their boundaries and their divide before the war was completely blown out of the water, because the society just couldn't function. It couldn't run anymore with the lack of communication between the classes, as their pay all seemed to be lowered, but ultimately similar. Looking over and dismissing me, I'd had a pointless, almost spiteful urge to make life difficult for him. That's just before Jip bites the girl, Gillian. I wanted to possess a piece of it, entitled me to it. That's in the first chapter, where he wants to possess that acorn. He has had this hunger, this ravenous appetite for Hundreds Hall ever since he was small. He's always been hungry to live a lavish lifestyle. The machine's very portable. I could bring it out to the hall. Is that the machine? Crikey, like something of Dr. Frankenstein's. I saw myself cross the silvered landscape and pass like smoke through Hundreds Gate. Ordinary life had fractionally tilted, and that I'd slipped into some other, odder, rather rarer realm. While I lay tossing in the dark, violent dreams, something dreadful happened out at the hall. That was the fire. I thought actually how much nicer and more like herself she would have looked with a scrubbed face. Here's Faraday just inserting his views about the appearance of women, even though it's not his place. She looked like a servant, plain Cinderella, and the sight of her, for some reason, absolutely enraged me. The gown was an old one, and to be honest, not quite becoming. A part of my upset was simple embarrassment, a basic masculine reluctance to have my name romantically linked with that of a notoriously plain girl. He's worrying about his status when he ultimately hasn't got any. We've seen his rejection of people from the upper class, but he's so desperate to fit in that he'll do anything. I was ashamed to acknowledge it, almost of distaste. My faltering desire almost dwindled completely, because he thought that hundreds had fallen out of his clutches. Again, this quote, is that the machine? Crikey, like something of Dr. Frankenstein's. The heiresses, unable to advance with the times, simply opted for retreat, for suicide and madness. This wouldn't be out of the question because during that time, take Roderick for example, he became very, very depressed after the wars. He had all of this responsibility to look after the manor, and also because he just couldn't maintain the, genteel mannerisms and behaviors that he had before. And a lot of people suffered with this change. Something that's been here all along and has just woken up. He produced photographs of Caroline's body. The images were grim ones. The house has sucked the life out of her. You might as well say we've only had trouble since you've been in it. This is what Roderick says to Faraday. No, sorry, what Caroline says to Faraday. And it's just very dramatic irony because I would say from around chapter 3, I knew that it was very obviously Faraday, so I think it's very ironic. Energy, parts of a person, unconscious parts, so strong or so troubled, or that they want something badly, something breaks away from them. This is Faraday's yearning for the ownership of Hundreds Hall and a higher class. Caroline is referred to locally as rather hearty, a natural spinster and a clever girl. She looked very much at home on that dusty country lane, rather as a tramp or a gypsy would. Her life, like that of her brother, had so much work in it and so few pleasures. As the upper class couldn't afford to employ people to work on their houses, they'd have to do the work themselves. She seemed self-conscious as she spoke. Never been much of a girl for displaying her feelings. She and our hostess cooked up this whole little do. Rouge on her cheeks and her mouth, red with lipsticks, was almost startlingly full and large. Flat boyish sandals and her bare legs were still unshaven. This just goes to show that she defies femininity. Her mismatched masculine features, she looked like a servant plain Cinderella. I'm tired of duties, I can't do it. I can't be a doctor's wife. I can't be anybody's wife. She shifted her legs, shifted them further. It took me a moment to realize she was trying to draw them back. With a violence that astonished me, she twisted free. She felt dead to my hand. That is when Faraday is trying to make a pass at her, and she rejects. Mrs. Ayres's expression was so wild. She looked just like her son, just like Roderick in the last worst phase of his delusions. But, of course, she eventually succumbs to them. The heiresses, unable to advance with the times, simply opted for retreat for suicide and madness. Mother's changing. She's like this vague maudlin thinking too much of the past. Mrs. Ayres's health, however, had taken another dip. She felt the starting up of a breeze striking her cheek. She realized now that the footsteps, so rapid and soft. Mrs. Ayres slumped and ungainly, her head rolling, her pose queer. The cord was drawn so tightly by her weight that they couldn't unknot it. Dreadful, bloated and dark. She startled away from the ivory mouthpiece, crying out and almost stumbling. Her laden heart gave her a desperate kick. I found a score of little cuts and bruises. One of two I saw with horror had the appearance of almost bites. The violence that Mrs. Ayres experiences in her thoughts and her death shows how jealous and angry Faraday is. It shows the extremity. I fear I shall end my days as one of those neglected old women left starving to death in their beds. This is really ironic because she does die, but not as late as she imagined. But this is almost an ideal death compared to what she experiences. She was dressed like an elegant French widow, perfectly well groomed. She is a perfect example of an aristocratic woman. I'd surprised her without charm as well as without powder and rings. Sadly and absently looking through the cloudy photographs, she looked pale and delicate like some slender sheathed flower. The old man ramped like the devil, of course, and thrashed me, right by the open window where any outdoor servant could have seen. That was the room in which her first daughter had lain sick with diphtheria, in the place, in fact, where she had died. She couldn't resist the dark temptation to open it properly and go inside. This room was left untouched for years, so it goes to show that something has infiltrated her mind and caused her to look back on these traumatizing and harrowing memories. I saw the house seem to swallow him up. I can contain the infection, that's the vital thing now, don't you agree? To keep the source of infection away from my sister and mother. Roderick is onto it before everyone else. He is the first person to realise that Faraday is the reason behind the supernatural occurrences. Mr. Roderick, who is currently a patient at a private institution for mental cases. The heiress is unable to advance with the times and opted for a retreat for suicide madness. That is a really good quote where you can very easily talk about the context of the genteel ways and the upper class. She moves things around where I can't find them and then pretends she hasn't touched them. So this is where he's talking about Betty, but it's actually the cause of the little stranger, the supernatural element. A cut on the bridge of his nose and a bad black eye. He keeps hearing noises when nothing is there. He looks like a frightened, hunted man. Roderick's removal, unable to emerge and face it, some nervous state. This time he walked into a footstool that had mysteriously left its usual place to set itself directly in my path. The thing that had found its way into the water was his missing collar. The shaving class shuddered again, began to inch its way across the washing stand towards him. This goes to show that Faraday is intelligent. He's a doctor and he would be very well aware of. I've accidentally changed the slide, but anyway, Faraday would be very well aware of mental illnesses as a doctor. And he's painted Roderick out to be this, withered, frail figure, when in reality, he he knows. He's well aware, as Faraday being the little stranger, that is causing it. But to everyone else, it looks like, he's maybe schizophrenic. For if the house like an oyster was at work on Betty, finding and disguising her with layer after minuscule layer of its own particular charm. Everything is jumpy in this house. If I don't go bothering him, she says, he won't come bothering me. This is a very important line. Faraday and Betty don't really have much of a relationship. One, because Faraday thinks that he is better than her because Betty is part of the working class. And also, they don't really interact too much. And that could be a reason why nothing bad happens to Betty. That's a bad thing. I think I shall die of fright sometimes. Quite convinced she could hear the dog pattering about upstairs. Wicked servant. Betty has country hands. His old schoolboy bedroom, just around the landing from hers, was given to Betty. I remember that queer outburst of hers. The way that Betty was given Roderick's old room shows the blurred lines between the class divisions. Betty seemed used to the hall now. All the recent dramas had served to fix her place in the household, even as they'd shaken Roderick from his. You've only had trouble since she's been in the house. And this is Faraday accusing Betty of being the little stranger, when she is arguably the most innocent person in the novel. We pay her more than we can afford. She eats the same food as us. Really, in a lot of ways, she's better off than we are. Again, the blur of the class division. The poor girl got into dreadful trouble. She parted her childish lips, unmemorable sort of girl. Naughty little girls, what a good little actress she was, uncertain whether her gaze was guiltless or shy. Me mum spends half her time out with other fellas, she don't care where I am. This shows Betty as a stereotypical working class girl. However, this becomes the norm as the classes are forced to interact with each other. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. I did do a lot of in-depth research on the context, so I hope that's helpful. There's a lot of Quizlets that you can use to revise quotes, just so you're not wasting time in the exam. It's a lot more useful. Remember to use the 15 minutes to plan your essay, so you can make really direct contrasts and similarities between the texts. Make sure your points are well thought out before you start writing them. Otherwise, sometimes your natural flow of ideas just aren't direct enough and they can sometimes lack detail. So definitely use the 15 minutes to make a plan. Thank you for watching, and I'll be uploading the Dorian Gray video soon. Thank you.